In 1972, a human being stood on the surface of the moon for the last time. That was more than 50 years ago, and we have not been back. 12 people walked on the moon across 6 separate landing missions. They collected 842 pounds of rock and soil. They left behind instruments, footprints, and flags. And then, quietly, the program ended. Not with a dramatic failure, not with a disaster. It simply stopped, and the world moved on as though that were the most natural thing in the world. Most people, if you ask them why we have never returned, will offer some version of the same explanation. We lost interest, the political will faded, the money went elsewhere. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like the kind of thing that just happens. And for 50 years, that explanation has sat comfortably in the background of the way we think about space. Half-remembered, unexamined, passed from one generation to the next, like something that does not need to be questioned, because the answer already seems obvious. The truth is almost precisely the opposite. The real reason we have not been back is far more disturbing than a budget decision or a shift in public attention. It cuts deeper than politics, deeper than funding cycles, deeper than any single administration's priorities. And once you see it clearly, the 50-year gap stops looking like an oversight and starts looking like something much harder to explain away and much harder to fix. If you enjoy documentaries that challenge what you think you know and reveal the deeper story behind the biggest questions in space, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you who supports this channel. Now, settle in and get yourself comfortable. Let's begin. There is a sentence that gets said about the moon so often, and so casually, that most people never stop to examine what it actually claims. You hear it in conversations about space funding. You hear it in debates about why we should or should not invest in exploration. You hear it from otherwise thoughtful people who have simply absorbed it from the culture around them and passed it along without ever pulling at its edges. The sentence is this: we have already been to the moon. Say it out loud and listen to what it implies. We have already been. Past tense. Finished. The thing is done. The question is answered. Yet the destination has been visited, and therefore, here is the part that almost never gets said aloud but is always smuggled in alongside it. Therefore, we could go back whenever we chose to. The already in that sentence does not just describe history. It describes capability. It suggests that the moon is a place we know how to reach, a problem we have solved, a door we have opened, and simply not walked through again, because we have had other things to attend to. It treats the moon the way you might treat a restaurant you visited once, years ago. Been there, know the menu, could go back any time. This reasoning feels comfortable because it has the shape of something true, and the shape of something true can be more persuasive than actual evidence, because it does not ask you to check. 12 humans did walk on the moon. 6 missions did land there between July of 1969 and December of 1972. 842 pounds of rock and soil did come back to Earth. These are facts, and they are not in dispute. But the leap from those facts to the conclusion that we have, in any meaningful sense, the ability to simply go back, that leap is where something has gone quietly wrong. Consider what the phrase is actually asking you to believe. It is asking you to believe that a capability, once demonstrated, becomes a permanent possession, that because a thing was done once, it can be done again. And on the surface, this seems almost too obvious to argue with, because it is true of most things in ordinary life. If you learned to ride a bicycle 20 years ago, you can still ride a bicycle. If a baker perfected a recipe in 1990 and never made that dish again, the recipe still exists, the technique is still understood, and the knowledge still lives somewhere. Most human skills, once acquired, do not simply vanish, but the moon is not a bicycle, and Apollo was not a recipe. What Apollo required was not a skill that one person or one institution learned and then carried forward. It required the simultaneous, coordinated operation of a supply chain, an industrial base, a trained workforce, a knowledge base, a set of functioning hardware systems, and a political and financial structure willing to sustain all of those things at once, not for a week, not for a year, but continuously for more than a decade. The moon is 3 days away, 3 days in a vehicle operating in a vacuum, shielded from radiation, yet dependent on systems that cannot fail, with no possibility of rescue if something goes wrong. Getting there does not require cleverness alone. It requires a continuous, living infrastructure of extraordinary complexity, all of it pointed in the same direction, all of it working at the same time. And here is the part that the casual phrase erases entirely. That infrastructure existed. For a specific window of time, roughly a decade in length, it existed. And then it was dismantled, not stored, not paused, not placed in a kind of institutional hibernation so it could be reactivated when the time came. It was taken apart. The people retired or moved on to other fields. The manufacturing lines closed, and the specialized knowledge that lived inside the heads of engineers who had never written it down, the hard-won understanding of how to solve problems that textbooks had not yet caught up with, that knowledge aged and, in many cases, died with the people who held it. What remained after Apollo was not a capability waiting to be used again. What remained was a record of what had been achieved, and those are not the same thing, at all. A museum exhibit documents what was accomplished. It does not replicate the conditions that made it possible. 842 pounds of moon rock sitting in a storage facility in Houston tells you that someone once knew how to go and come back. It does not tell you that anyone knows how to do it now. The moon is 3 days away, and knowing the distance does not mean you have a ship. Yet there is a version of this same error that appears everywhere in how people talk about human achievement, and it is always seductive because it allows us to feel more capable than we are. We have split the atom, therefore we understand the atom. We have sequenced the genome, therefore we can edit life. We have been to the moon, therefore the moon is within reach. Each of these sentences contains a truth and then smuggles in something much larger, something that has not been earned. The having done it is taken as proof of the can do it again, and the gap between those two things, the gap where the infrastructure lived, where the workforce was trained, where the supply chains ran, is simply skipped over, as if none of it was ever load-bearing. The moon is 3 days away. That is genuinely not very far, by any cosmic measure. Yet it is close enough that the original Apollo missions could maintain radio contact with Earth in something close to real time. It is close enough that we sent people there 6 times in the span of 3.5 years. And yet, 50 years have passed and no human being has left low Earth orbit since. Not because the moon moved, not because the physics changed. The sentence, "We have already been to the moon," has been functioning for 5 decades as a reason not to examine that gap, as a kind of intellectual sedative that lets the question feel answered when it has barely been asked. Strip away the mythology, set aside the inspirational speeches and the slow-motion footage. Look at Apollo not as a triumph of human aspiration, but as a product of specific historical conditions. And understanding why requires dismantling everything most people think they know about how and why Apollo happened in the first place. Most people, when they think about why we went to the moon, reach for the same story. They reach for Kennedy's voice and the crowd at Rice University and the line about choosing to do things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. They reach for the image of astronauts as explorers in the oldest tradition, driven by the same restless curiosity that sent ships over the horizon before anyone knew what lay beyond. It is a beautiful story. It is also, in its most important particulars, not true. This is the first and most important thing to understand about why we went to the moon. Everything that follows depends on it. Apollo was not born from wonder. It was born from fear. And to feel that fear the way the people who made the decision actually felt it, you have to go back to the autumn of 1957 and understand what happened on the night of October 4th. Because what happened that night was not a scientific milestone in the sense that most people mean when they use that phrase. It was not the excitement of a new discovery. It was something much closer to the sensation of hearing a sound in your house late at night that you cannot immediately explain, except that the sound was in the sky. It was crossing overhead every 96 minutes, and it was the Soviet Union telling the world something it had not said before in quite so clear a language. The object the Soviets launched that night was called Sputnik, and it weighed 83 kilograms. That is less than the weight of an average adult human being. You could, theoretically, have carried Sputnik out of a building without mechanical assistance. It was roughly the size of a beach ball. It broadcast a simple radio signal, a repeating beep that amateur radio operators around the world could pick up with equipment available at the time. There was nothing exotic about its function. It did not carry weapons. It did not take photographs or transmit intelligence. It circled the Earth once every 96 minutes, and it beeped, and that was essentially the entirety of what it did. And that was enough, because what the engineers and the military analysts and the national security officials in Washington understood, in the hours and days after Sputnik's launch, was not the object itself. What they understood was the inference. If the Soviet Union could put 83 kilograms into orbit, if it had developed a rocket powerful enough to reach orbital velocity and place a payload above the atmosphere and keep it there, then the same technology, pointed in a different direction, could deliver something far heavier than Sputnik to an address on the surface of the Earth. The beeping was not a scientific transmission. It was a demonstration. The Soviet Union was showing the world, and specifically showing Washington, that it had developed intercontinental ballistic missile technology of a kind that changed the strategic geography of the entire planet. And it was doing this by putting a metal sphere the size of a beach ball over American cities every 96 minutes, where anyone with a radio could hear it passing. Sit with what that meant for a moment. The continental United States had spent the better part of its history protected by oceans. 2 of them. That geographic fact had shaped American foreign policy and American psychology in ways that ran very deep. The oceans were not just water. They were a buffer, a margin, a reason to feel that whatever happened in Europe or Asia could not arrive on American soil without warning. Sputnik's orbit erased that buffer in a single evening. Not because the satellite itself was dangerous, but because the rocket that launched it could reach anywhere on Earth, and there was no ocean wide enough to stop it. The fear that followed was not abstract. It was specific, and it was institutional, and it ran from the Pentagon into Congress, and from Congress into the press, and from the press into every household in America that owned a television or a radio, which by 1957 was nearly all of them. The question being asked in those households was not a philosophical one about human achievement. It was a practical one about survival. And then, before that fear had fully settled, before the United States had found its footing in response to Sputnik, the Soviet Union did something worse. On April 12, 1961, a 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a spacecraft called Vostok, and in 108 minutes, he completed a single orbit of the Earth and landed safely. He was the first human being in space, and he got there before the United States. And the entire world watched it happen. America watched it happen from the ground. That distinction, Gagarin in orbit while American astronauts had not yet left the atmosphere, was not experienced as a scientific setback. It was experienced as a verdict. In the ideological contest between the Soviet system and the American system, the Soviet system had just demonstrated in front of every nation on Earth that it could do something the Americans could not. John F. Kennedy had been president for less than 3 months when Gagarin orbited. He asked his advisors what it would take to beat the Soviet Union in space, not to compete, not to close the gap, but to win a contest so decisively that the victory could not be disputed. The answer he received was that the Soviets were ahead in rockets, ahead in orbital capability, and ahead in nearly every category that was currently being measured. The only way to guarantee an American victory was to move the finish line, to choose a destination so far beyond what either side had achieved that the race would effectively start over. And the destination his advisors pointed to was the moon. Kennedy stood before Congress on May 25, 1961, and he did not say that the United States should go to the moon because it would expand human knowledge, or because the moon held scientific secrets worth uncovering. He said the goal was to demonstrate American capability in a theater where the whole world was watching. The moon was chosen not because it was scientifically optimal. It was chosen because it was far enough and difficult enough and visible enough, is that whoever got there first would win an argument that could not be settled any other way. The moon was not a destination. It was a proof, a demonstration of technological and organizational and industrial supremacy designed to be broadcast to every nation still deciding which side of the Cold War it wanted to align with. And this is the thing that changes everything about how you interpret what came after. Apollo was not an exploration program that happened to occur during the Cold War. It was a Cold War program that happened to involve exploration. Not wonder, but fear. Not curiosity, but calculation. Not the pioneer spirit pressing outward into the unknown, but two superpowers pressing against each other and using the moon as the place where one of them would be proven right. The flag they planted was a real flag, and the rocks they brought back were real rocks. But the reason they went, the actual reason, the load-bearing reason that got the funding approved and the rockets built and the astronauts trained, was political from the first day to the last. And if Apollo was designed to win a race, built to answer a political question, funded at the level of a military mobilization because the stakes felt like the stakes of a war, then you have to ask what happens to a program like that once the race is over. What happens to a program like that once the race is over? The answer, it turns out, is not complicated, and it is not slow. A program built to win a race ends when the race ends. Not gradually, not gracefully. What happened after Apollo was not a redirection, it was a demolition. And to understand why that word is accurate rather than dramatic, you have to first understand the scale of what was built. At its peak, the Apollo program consumed somewhere between 4 and 5% of the entire federal budget. That number is easy to read past, so it is worth holding it still for a moment. The federal government funds the military, the interstate highway system, Social Security, Medicare, all of the diplomatic apparatus, the courts, the prison system, the entire structure of the federal government. Every agency, every department, every program, every obligation. Out of all of that, 1 in every $20 or $25 was being directed toward putting human beings on the moon, not toward the space program broadly, not toward NASA as a whole institution, specifically toward Apollo. And that is a level of funding concentration that does not happen in peacetime for anything short of an emergency, and even then, it is rare. The only comparison that holds is wartime mobilization, the kind of spending a nation does when it believes its survival depends on the outcome. And the spending was matched by the scale of human effort behind it. 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program. Not 400,000 people at NASA. The agency itself employed a small fraction of that, but 400,000 people across government, across contractors, across universities, across supplier networks that stretched into virtually every state in the country. Engineers and machinists and mathematicians and welders and seamstresses who stitched the fabric of the spacesuits by hand. Guidance system designers and propellant chemists and physicians, monitoring the physiology of human bodies under stresses no body had ever experienced. Software programmers writing code for computers less powerful than the device you might use today to look something up on the internet, doing it without the tools and without the references that now make such work routine. 400,000 people working across hundreds of separate organizations, coordinating toward a single objective with a clarity of purpose that most institutions never achieve and never come close to. That is not a program. That is a mobilization. It is a civilization pressing its full industrial and intellectual weight against a single problem. A magnificent, meticulously engineered, breathtakingly expensive sprint. And sprints, by their nature, are not designed to continue. The entire structure, the funding, the workforce, the supply chains, the institutional urgency was calibrated to reach one specific point as fast as possible. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, the race was functionally over. The question had been answered, the argument had been settled, the proof had been delivered, and the forces that had assembled those 400,000 people and directed that 4 to 5% of federal spending began, almost immediately, to dissolve. Not because anyone made a dramatic decision that it was time to stop, because the purpose that had held it together was gone, and purposes like that do not linger. By 1975, NASA's share of the federal budget had fallen to roughly 1%, and the slide from 4 or 5 down to 1 did not take a generation. It did not take a decade of slow erosion. It happened inside a few years, while the Apollo hardware was still being manufactured, while some missions were still flying, and it did not stop there. In the decades since, NASA's budget has oscillated between roughly 0.5% and 1% of the federal budget, sometimes rising slightly toward the top of that range during periods of renewed ambition, sometimes falling toward the bottom. But the floor established after Apollo has never been broken through. The funding that once existed has not returned, and there is no serious argument being made anywhere that it should. That window closed, and the conditions that opened it are not present anymore. What this means in practical terms is that the infrastructure, the workforce, the institutional knowledge, the production lines, the testing facilities, all of it was sized for wartime level spending and then asked to survive on a peacetime fraction of what it had been given. Some of it contracted. Some of it pivoted to other programs. Some of it simply stopped. The people retired or moved into other industries. The specialized skills that had taken years to develop were no longer in demand at the scale that would keep them alive. The contractors who had built components for Saturn V rockets retooled for other work, or wound down the divisions that had handled Apollo, or closed entirely. The thing that had been assembled over a decade at enormous cost and effort was disassembled over a much shorter period at very little fanfare. Yet because disassembly does not make the news the way assembly does. What was lost in that dismantling turns out to be far more than most people realize. And that story begins with the factories that went silent and the engineers who walked away. The factories came first. Before the engineers retired, before the documentation aged, before anyone had time to understand what was being lost, the physical infrastructure began to disappear. Production lines that had taken years to establish and hundreds of millions of dollars to equip were shut down, retooled, or demolished. The specialized tooling, the jigs that had held rocket stages in precise alignment during assembly, the welding fixtures that had been calibrated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, at the test rigs that had simulated the thermal and mechanical stresses of spaceflight, was scrapped, not mothballed, not archived in some federal warehouse against the possibility of future need. Scrapped. What happened after Apollo was not a redirection. It was a demolition. Consider what it actually took to build the first stage of a Saturn V rocket. The stage was assembled at the Michoud Assembly Facility outside New Orleans, a building so large that weather can form near its ceiling on humid days. The structure that emerged from that building was taller than a 15-story office building and weighed, when fueled, roughly as much as a fully loaded naval destroyer. Moving it required specialized barges on the Mississippi River and then along the Gulf Coast, because there was no road or rail system capable of handling it. The facility, after Apollo's production lines went quiet, was repurposed to manufacture the external fuel tanks for the space shuttle, which were a different shape, a different specification, a different engineering challenge requiring different tooling and different expertise. The Saturn V production infrastructure was not preserved inside Michoud. It was replaced by something else, because the building still had a purpose, and purposes do not wait. The second stage of the Saturn V was built by North American Rockwell, which moved to defense contracts when the Apollo work dried up. The third stage was built by Douglas Aircraft, which was absorbed into McDonnell Douglas and eventually into Boeing. The companies still exist in one form or another, reorganized and merged and redirected through the decades. But the divisions that built those stages, the teams, the supply chains, the specialized vendors who produced specific components to precise specifications, those did not survive the transition. They were wound down. The people were reassigned or let go. The institutional knowledge those divisions carried was not transferred into some central repository. It dispersed with the people who held it. And then there are the engines. Each F-1 engine, 5 of which powered the Saturn V's first stage, produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. That is not a number that yields easily to comparison, but try to hold it against this. The thrust produced by a single F-1 engine was roughly equivalent to the combined output of 85 of the most powerful locomotives ever built by American railroads, all firing simultaneously, all pushing in the same direction. 5 of those engines fired at once during launch. The force was not just large, it was operating at the edge of what materials science could contain, with combustion chamber pressures approaching 1,000 pounds per square inch, temperatures that would have destroyed conventional alloys, and fuel and oxidizer flowing through roughly 2,600 individual orifices machined into the injector plate, each one precisely sized, each one positioned to produce a specific mixing pattern that had taken years of combustion, instability research to perfect. That injector plate alone represented knowledge that no textbook fully captured. The people who machined it, who tested it, and who refined the design through failures that sometimes resulted in engines destroying themselves on the test stand, those people understood things about the behavior of that hardware that they could not have fully written down if you had asked them to. When the production lines closed, that understanding did not go into storage. It retired, it moved on, it aged, and in many cases, it died. What remains are 3 Saturn V rockets preserved in museums, one at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, one at Johnson Space Center in Houston, one at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. They are extraordinary objects. Horizontal on their display cradles, they stretch longer than a football field. The engineering precision visible in their surfaces, the scale of the engines at their base, and the sheer improbability of their existence as human-made objects. All of it is present, intact, real, but you cannot fuel a museum exhibit. You cannot launch a display piece. Those 3 rockets are not stored capability. They are not proof that the capability still exists. They are what remains after the capability has been removed, the way a skeleton is what remains after the living tissue is gone. They tell you what once existed. They do not give you any of it back. Not the production lines, not the tooling, not the 2,600 machined orifices refined through years of combustion testing, not the institutional knowledge of the engineers who stood next to that hardware and understood it in a way that no drawing fully communicates. A Saturn V rocket contains roughly 3 million individual parts, yet 3 museum rockets contain 9 million parts between them. And none of those parts can produce what they once produced, because the parts were never the capability. The capability was the industrial ecosystem that made the parts, tested the parts, understood why the parts behaved the way they did, and could make more of them when something failed. that ecosystem is gone. The destruction of the hardware, as total and as irreversible as it was, turns out to be only the most visible layer of a far deeper destruction. What the factories lost when they closed was measurable. You could walk through the building afterward and point to the empty floor where the tooling had been. What the workforce lost when it dispersed is harder to see and harder to quantify, and it is, in the end, more consequential. Yet what the workforce lost when it dispersed is harder to see and harder to quantify, and understanding why requires sitting with something that most people instinctively resist: the idea that knowledge can exist in a human body and nowhere else. We tend to think of knowledge as transferable. Write it down, photograph it, encode it in a drawing, and it survives the person who first understood it. This is true for most knowledge. A physicist who dies leaves behind equations. A historian who retires leaves behind books. The information persists independent of the person who held it, and someone else can pick it up and continue from where they left off. This is the assumption most people carry into the question of Apollo. The blueprints exist, the specifications were written down, and the dimensions were recorded in engineering drawings that were archived, catalogued, and preserved. And so, the assumption goes, the knowledge was preserved along with them. This is wrong in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. Consider what it means to weld a fuel tank designed to hold liquid hydrogen at temperatures approaching 250 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The metallurgy alone requires understanding how certain aluminum alloys behave when they are cooled to temperatures at which ordinary metals become brittle, where the material's properties shift in ways that a warm environment welding technique will not account for. But that understanding, as technical and specific as it is, can at least be written down. So what cannot be fully written down is what happens in the hands of the person holding the torch. A weld is not a specification. It is a physical act performed in real time on a real piece of metal that is responding to heat in a way that no document perfectly anticipates. The angle of the torch changes the penetration depth. The speed of travel changes the width of the fusion zone. The distance from the work surface changes the heat input in ways that interact with the base metal's thermal conductivity, the filler material's composition, and the invisible history of stress already present in the workpiece. Experienced welders speak about developing a feel for the puddle, the molten pool of metal that forms at the tip of the torch, because the puddle communicates information that cannot be read off a gauge, and it moves differently when the heat is right. It has a color, a fluidity, a surface tension that shifts as conditions change. Learning to read that feedback takes years, and the reading happens in the body before it happens in the mind. You adjust the angle slightly before you have consciously decided to, because the accumulated experience of hundreds of previous welds has trained your nervous system to respond to signals your conscious attention might not even register. That is not a skill you can archive. It is a skill you can only pass on through proximity, through apprenticeship, through shared physical presence over extended time, through the kind of learning that happens when an experienced hand reaches over and adjusts a novice's wrist angle without either of them saying a word. At Apollo's peak, our roughly 250,000 engineers and technicians were working across the program in some capacity. Within 5 years of the final lunar mission, that workforce had dispersed. Some retired, some moved into defense contracts that demanded different skills. Some entered industries with no connection to aerospace. The specific population of people who understood cryogenic welding at the scale and specification that Saturn required, who had spent years developing the embodied knowledge that made the hardware possible, scattered into a world that no longer had a use for precisely what they knew, and the apprenticeship chain broke. Because that kind of knowledge does not persist without continuous practice and continuous transmission. A weld technique that is not taught to a new generation does not wait, and it is practiced or it is lost. The same principle operated at every level of the production process. The machinists who worked on the turbopump components held tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch on parts spinning at 6,000 revolutions per minute. Translated into physical terms, that tolerance is roughly a tenth of a human hair. On a component spinning at 6,000 revolutions per minute, a deviation beyond that tolerance does not produce a slightly imperfect part. It produces failure, catastrophic, instantaneous failure of the kind that could destroy an engine that was generating more force than most people can meaningfully picture. Holding that tolerance on those components required understanding how the cutting tool behaved as it wore, how the metal responded to the heat of machining, and how the measuring instrument itself needed to be calibrated and handled to produce a reading you could trust. Those judgments lived in hands and in eyes, accumulated over careers, refined through the feedback of parts that worked and parts that failed. They were not fully in the drawings, and then, in the 1990s, engineers at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville went looking for the drawings anyway. There were discussions about potentially reviving Saturn V production, or at minimum studying its engineering in detail, and the logical starting point was the documentation. What they found was not what they expected. The blueprints, where they existed, were incomplete. Specifications referenced internal codes that no one could trace, shorthand for processes or materials or standards that had been legible inside the working program and had become opaque once the program ended. And in place of detailed instructions, in the spaces where the knowledge most needed to be preserved, they found a phrase that appeared again and again throughout the documentation. Per standard shop practice. That phrase was not a summary. It was not a placeholder. It was, at the time it was written, a complete instruction, because there were thousands of people on the shop floor for whom the standard shop practice was something they had performed so many times that documenting it would have felt like documenting how to breathe. But by the 1990s, there was no shop, there was no practice. Yes, there was no one for whom that phrase pointed to anything retrievable. Sit with that for a moment. The instructions for building the most powerful machine ever flown contained steps that no living person could interpret. The knowledge had walked out the door with the people who practiced it. The paper survived. The understanding did not. And this distinction between the record of a thing and the living capacity to do the thing is perhaps the most unsettling lesson embedded in the entire Apollo story. Knowledge does not automatically survive its own documentation. It survives through use, through transmission, through the continuous chain of people who practice it and teach it and practice it again. When that chain breaks, the paper that remains is not a backup. It is an artifact. Rebuilding that machine, or rather, building an entirely new one suited to modern requirements, is the central challenge of the current era. And that challenge is made enormously harder by a fact that most people find deeply counterintuitive. What NASA spent the next 50 years doing. What NASA spent the next 50 years doing was not what most people imagine. The assumption, which is entirely reasonable and almost entirely wrong, is that the agency turned its attention from the moon to other problems. That it spent those decades slowly building towards something deeper, something farther, working at a reduced pace, but in the same general direction. The truth is almost precisely the opposite. What followed Apollo was not a slower march forward. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, a circle. Yes, the space shuttle flew for the first time in April of 1981. It flew its final mission in July of 2011. 30 years of operation, 135 missions total. And the program remains one of the most technically sophisticated things a human civilization has ever constructed and operated. The orbiter itself was a genuinely extraordinary machine, a reusable spacecraft that could carry a crew of up to 7, deploy and retrieve satellites, conduct scientific experiments in orbit, and return to Earth landing on a runway like an airplane. It was, by any reasonable standard, a magnificent achievement, and it was a magnificent dead end. To understand why, you need to hold two numbers in your head at the same time. The first is 600 kilometers. Yes, that is the maximum altitude the shuttle could reach, the highest point above the Earth's surface that this 30-year program, this 135 missions, this full professional lifetime of a space agency was capable of going. 600 kilometers. The second number is 384,000 kilometers. That is the distance to the moon. 600 versus 384,000. The ratio there is roughly 1 to 640, which means that for every kilometer of progress the shuttle represented toward the lunar surface, there were still 640 more kilometers it had no capacity to cover. Not because of a design flaw that might be remedied, not because of a limitation they were working to overcome, simply because the shuttle was built for low Earth orbit, designed for low Earth orbit, and could not go anywhere else. The harbor ferry analogy is the one that makes this distance legible in a way that raw numbers resist. Imagine a harbor ferry, a solid, reliable, well-engineered vessel that carries passengers and vehicles back and forth across a bay, a distance of perhaps a few kilometers. It does this work well. It docks cleanly, loads efficiently, makes dozens of crossings a year. Now ask it to cross the Atlantic Ocean, not because it is poorly built, but because it was never built for open ocean. Its hull, its engines, its fuel capacity, its navigation systems, everything about it is scaled to the bay it serves. The Atlantic is not a larger version of the bay. It is a categorically different problem. The space shuttle could no more reach the moon than that ferry could reach Portugal. And the gap is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. And yet, 384,000 kilometers has a way of staying abstract even after you have heard it several times, so consider it from a different direction. If you drove toward the moon at the speed of a highway, 70 miles per hour, without stopping for fuel or sleep, or any of the ordinary interruptions of a road trip, you would arrive in roughly 6 months. Not 6 days, 6 months of continuous driving, every hour of every day. The shuttle's maximum altitude, expressed in the same terms, represents about 5.5 hours of that drive. You have barely cleared the driveway. The whole of low Earth orbit, the entire domain that the shuttle inhabited for 30 years, sits within that first afternoon of a journey measured in seasons. Sit with that for a moment, because what comes next requires that it land fully. The program that consumed NASA's operational identity from 1981 through 2011. The program that absorbed the agency's engineering talent, its institutional energy, its public visibility, and, critically, its budget, operated entirely within those 5.5 hours. Every mission, every orbit, every photograph of Earth from above, all of it took place in what is, on the scale of the journey to the moon, the parking lot. The cost of that parking lot was roughly $200 billion over the life of the program, adjusted for inflation. Each individual shuttle mission cost approximately $1.5 billion when all expenses were accounted for honestly. The operations, the ground support, yet the refurbishment between flights, the administrative overhead of a standing army of engineers and technicians and managers required to keep the system functioning. $1.5 billion per flight, at an average rate of 4.5 missions per year against an original promise of 40 to 50. The shuttle was supposed to be a bus, affordable, frequent, routine. It became, in practice, something closer to the opposite. The turnaround between flights was expected to take weeks. It regularly took months. The economics that were supposed to justify the shuttle's existence never materialized, and the program ran on institutional momentum and sunk cost as much as on any coherent strategic rationale. $200 billion. That number deserves the same patience as the distance number, because it is easy to hear it and let it wash past as simply a large amount of money. Consider what Apollo cost, in the same inflation-adjusted terms, roughly comparable, within the range of uncertainty that attaches to any such historical accounting. Two programs, similar total costs. Apollo produced, at its conclusion, a demonstrated capability to send human beings to the surface of another world and return them safely to Earth. The shuttle produced, at its conclusion, a demonstrated capability to carry cargo and crew to an altitude of 600 kilometers and return them to a runway in California or Florida. One of those outcomes is a destination. The other is a ceiling. And for 30 years, that ceiling was the whole sky. But what the ISS deepened, and what the failed attempts to actually break the cycle reveal, is that this was not an accident of one program's choices. It was a pattern, repeating. Several attempts were made to break this cycle. Understanding why they all failed reveals the structural nature of the problem. The first attempt came in 1989, 20 years after Armstrong walked on the moon. George Herbert Walker Bush stood on the steps of the National Air and Space Museum and proposed what he called the Space Exploration Initiative, a program to return to the moon and eventually send humans to Mars. The speech was compelling, the ambition was genuine, and within a matter of weeks, NASA delivered what became known as the 90-day report, a detailed assessment of what the Space Exploration Initiative would actually require in terms of funding, infrastructure, and time. The number that came back was $500 billion, spread across 20 to 30 years. Not 500 million, not 50 billion. $500 billion, at a moment when NASA's annual budget sat at roughly $7 billion, at a moment when the Cold War was ending and the sense of emergency that had once justified spending at Apollo-era levels had dissolved entirely into something resembling quiet triumph. Congress looked at that number and did not debate it carefully or propose a modified version or ask NASA to find efficiencies. It simply declined to fund the program in any meaningful way. Within 2 years, yes, the Space Exploration Initiative was dead. Not scaled back, not deferred, dead. There was no formal cancellation announcement that most people remember, no moment of public reckoning. The program was simply not allocated the resources it required, and so it stopped existing in any practical sense. 20 years after the last human stepped off the lunar surface, the first serious attempt to return lasted less time than a presidential term. 15 years passed. Then, in January of 2004, George Walker Bush stood before an audience at NASA headquarters and announced what he called the Vision for Space Exploration, a plan to retire the shuttle, complete the International Space Station, and then direct NASA's attention toward returning humans to the moon by 2020, and eventually toward Mars beyond that. The program that grew from that speech was called Constellation. It was not a minor initiative. It included a new crew vehicle named Orion, a crew launch rocket called Ares 1, a heavy-lift rocket called Ares 5, and a lunar lander called Altair. It was, in structural terms, a genuine attempt to rebuild the architecture that Apollo had once represented, a complete system for getting human beings off the Earth, across the gulf of space, and onto the surface of the moon. Engineers were hired, facilities were opened, families relocated from one side of the country to the other for jobs on a program that felt, for the first time in decades, like it was pointed in the right direction. Then, the administration changed. A review committee called the Augustine Commission examined Constellation's progress and its budget requirements, and concluded that the program was underfunded for its stated goals, that it was, in essence, another iteration of the same structural problem, promising something ambitious on a budget that could not support the ambition. In 2010, the Obama administration cancelled Constellation. 6 years of development, billions of dollars spent. Orion had made progress. Ares had made progress. Altair was still largely conceptual. The engineers who had moved their families, who had bought houses near the facilities where they worked, who had spent 6 years building something that was now not going to be built, those engineers received layoff notices. The hardware that existed was partly absorbed into successor programs, partly shelved, and the institutional knowledge that had begun to accumulate around Constellation scattered in the way it always scatters when a program ends, into other industries, into retirement, into the permanent background noise of expertise that exists nowhere in particular. And then there is Artemis, a space policy directive signed in 2017 committed the United States to returning humans to the moon, with a target of 2024. That target became 2025, then 2026. And it is not yet clear that 2026 will hold. The Space Launch System, the rocket at the center of Artemis, has been estimated by NASA's own Inspector General to cost more than $4 billion per flight, a number that is not a budget overrun in the traditional sense, but a structural feature of how the program was assembled and what it requires to operate. $4 billion for a single launch, in an era when NASA's total annual budget is approximately $25 billion, meaning that a handful of Artemis launches consume a substantial fraction of everything the agency does in a year. What this sequence reveals is not a series of unfortunate accidents. It is not bad luck distributed across 4 decades. What it reveals is not merely inefficient management, but something actively destructive. Each cancelled program leaves the next attempt starting from a position weaker than the one before. Engineers trained on Constellation were not fully available to Artemis. Knowledge accumulated across 6 years of Constellation development dissolved in the way knowledge always dissolves when the people who hold it are told their services are no longer required. The 1980s and 90s produced institutions that might have rebuilt post-Apollo capability and instead were never funded. The 2000s produced a program that built real hardware and then cancelled it. Every iteration of this cycle costs not just the money spent, but the compounding value of what that money might have purchased if it had been sustained. The honest answer to whether any single program can survive this gauntlet is that we do not know. No post-Apollo lunar program has survived it. Not one. The Space Exploration Initiative did not survive a change in political will. A Constellation did not survive a change in administration. Artemis is still alive, but it is younger than Constellation was when Constellation was cancelled, and it is operating in a political environment that has not yet been tested across the kind of timeline that reaching the moon actually requires. A magnificent ambition, announced with ceremony and sincerity, has a pattern of becoming a magnificent casualty, and the word sits differently now than it did at the beginning of this, not as admiration, but as a kind of warning, because the question that keeps asserting itself, the one that none of these programs has answered, is not whether America has the engineering capability to return to the moon. It is whether any democratic government operating under normal political conditions across normal political timescales is structurally capable of sustaining the commitment that returning to the moon actually demands. And this is the question that does not let go, because most people, when they hear the history of cancelled programs and missed deadlines and budgets that never quite materialized, arrive at a particular conclusion. They conclude that the problem is leadership, that if the right person were in the right office at the right moment, with the right political instincts and the right commitment, the pattern would break. They conclude that the problem is funding, that a more generous appropriation, sustained over more years, would carry a program across the finish line. These conclusions feel reasonable. They have the texture of solvable problems: better management, more money, stronger political will, and they are wrong in ways that are difficult to overstate. The problem is not the quality of the people involved. The problem is the shape of the timeline, and what happens when you place that shape against the architecture of democratic government and discover that they do not fit. They have never fit. They cannot be made to fit without changing something fundamental about one of them, and nobody has changed either. Consider the timeline first, in its plainest form. developing a human-rated deep space vehicle, a spacecraft that can carry human beings beyond low Earth orbit, support their survival across days or weeks of transit, and return them safely, takes somewhere between 10 and 15 years under normal development conditions. That range is not pessimism, and it is not an excuse. It is what the record shows. So the Space Shuttle, from serious conceptual development to its first flight in April of 1981, required approximately 9 years. The International Space Station went from formal international agreement to the arrival of its first permanent crew in November of 2000, over more than a decade. The Space Launch System was formally authorized in 2011 and flew its first uncrewed test mission in late 2022, more than 12 years from authorization to first flight. Orion, the crew capsule designed to carry astronauts beyond low Earth orbit, has been in active development for nearly 2 decades without yet carrying a crew to the surface of another world. These are not anomalies. Each of these programs moved with the urgency that an organization like NASA is capable of generating, and none of them moved faster, and the timeline keeps arriving in the same range, 10 to 15 years from serious commitment to operational hardware. Now, consider the political structure inside which that timeline must be sustained. A President of the United States serves a maximum of 8 years. That is not a limitation that can be negotiated away. 8 years, a program that requires 10 to 15 years of uninterrupted development, therefore exceeds the maximum possible continuity of the executive will that launched it. Not sometimes, every time. A president who announces a lunar return program in their first year in office will, at best, be handing that program to a successor when the hardware is perhaps halfway to completion. That successor made no promise attached to that program. That successor has their own priorities and their own political coalition, their own vision of what the agency should be doing, and their own inherited budget pressures. The program must make its case, again, from scratch, to a person who did not build it and does not own it. And then there is the budget cycle. Not the presidential cycle, the annual one. Every 12 months, Congress passes a spending authorization. Every 12 months, a program that requires 15 years of sustained investment must survive a vote. Not once. Not at the beginning and the end. Every single year for 15 consecutive years. In any of those years, a recession can arrive. A geopolitical emergency can arrive. A different committee chairman can arrive. A budget reconciliation process that trades aerospace spending for something with more immediate electoral consequences can arrive. Yes, the program does not need to be cancelled to be damaged. It only needs to be reduced, or delayed, or restructured, or placed in a holding pattern for 18 months while a supplemental funding question gets resolved. Any of those events, each of them routine in the normal functioning of democratic government, adds time to a timeline that is already longer than any single presidential administration. The moon is 3 days away. It was 3 days away in 1972. It is 3 days away now. The distance has not changed. Everything else has. And what has changed is not the technology and not the engineering knowledge, at least not entirely. It is the political and institutional environment through which a program must travel before that distance can be covered. That environment has a particular structure. It changes every 4 years at minimum. It recalibrates every 2 years when congressional seats turn over. It operates on an annual funding cycle that treats a 15-year engineering commitment, the way a grocery budget treats a weekly shopping list, as something to be renegotiated every time you return to the store. And inside this structure, something happens to the people doing the work that never appears in the official histories of cancelled programs. The aerospace workforce, the engineers and technicians and project managers who spend years developing hardware and accumulating the specific, embodied knowledge that no document can fully preserve, develops a particular orientation toward the programs they are building. It is not cynicism exactly, though it can look like that from the outside. and it is something more like a learned wariness that comes from watching programs end. An engineer who joined the workforce in the 1990s and worked through the early years of Constellation, then watched Constellation disappear in 2010, and then joined Artemis, carries that history in the way anyone carries the specific weight of previous losses. Recruiting people into a program like this, when the most honest answer to the question of whether the program will still exist in 10 years is a silence that speaks for itself, becomes progressively harder. And the people who join anyway bring that wariness with them, which is not their failure, but their rationality, because the history they are responding to is real. A program that requires 15 years of unbroken institutional commitment, operating inside a system where presidential commitment resets every 8 years at most, and budget commitments reset every 12 months, is not facing a management problem. It is facing a structural contradiction built into the relationship between what the work requires and what the governing system can provide. Better leadership does not resolve a mathematical mismatch. More efficient program management does not extend a presidential term. Political will, however genuine at the moment of announcement, cannot be transferred intact from one administration to the next. These are not variables that can be optimized. They are the fixed parameters of how democratic governance works, placed directly against the fixed parameters of what hard engineering actually takes. Some observers conclude from this history that sustained lunar presence is politically impossible in a democratic system. This conclusion is understandable, but it is premature, because there is at least one significant counterexample. The counterexample is the International Space Station, and it matters enormously, not as a triumphant refutation of everything that has been said, but as a precise and instructive exception. The kind that, if you look at it carefully enough, tells you exactly what conditions have to be met for a long-duration space program to survive the particular pressures that have destroyed every other attempt. Continuous human habitation of the International Space Station began in November of 2000, when the first resident crew docked and began what has become the longest unbroken sequence of human presence in space in history. That sequence has now run for more than 25 years. It has survived 5 presidential administrations, each with different priorities, different budget philosophies, different visions for what the space program should be. It survived the Columbia disaster in 2003, which destroyed a space shuttle and 7 astronauts and temporarily grounded the entire crew rotation system that the station depended on. It survived the retirement of the shuttle fleet in 2011, after which the United States spent 9 years with no domestic capability to reach the station at all, relying entirely on Russian Soyuz spacecraft for crew transport. It survived the significant deterioration of relations with Russia following events that, in almost any other context, would have severed the partnership entirely. And through all of this, through disasters and diplomatic strain and the complete restructuring of the vehicles used to reach it, the lights stayed on. People remained aboard. The station did not close. This is not a trivial achievement. Given everything that has been documented about how democratic governments relate to long-term space programs, the station's survival across a quarter century represents something genuinely different in kind, not just in degree. So the question worth asking is what made it different? Because if the structural conditions that sustained the station can be understood, then they can potentially be applied elsewhere. And those conditions, when you examine them carefully, come down to 3 things that the station had and that every cancelled program lacked. The first is international entanglement, not cooperation in the loose, aspirational sense, but binding institutional dependency. The station was not built by one nation that other nations observed and admired. It was built by multiple nations in a structure where each partner's investment was contingent on the other's continuing. Pulling out did not simply end the program. It damaged relationships, invalidated treaties, and created concrete political and diplomatic costs that any administration choosing to withdraw would have to absorb. A cancelled domestic program costs votes and credibility. An abandoned international partnership costs something considerably harder to recover. And the second is distributed economic benefit. The station's contracts and subcontracts were not concentrated in a few facilities that a change in political priorities could defund and dismantle. They were spread across enough congressional districts and enough allied nations that the program had something close to immune system cells scattered through the body politic, local economic interests that would generate organized resistance to any attempt to shut the program down. This is not a flattering description of how the station survived. It is an accurate one. The third is continuous visible output. The station produced results on a timescale that human attention can follow. Not a promised destination decades away, but constant, ongoing science, regular crew rotations, visible activity, unbroken presence. And it was always doing something. It was always there. And programs that are always there are very difficult to cancel, because cancellation is a specific action, a positive choice to end something ongoing, which requires a different kind of political will than the passive choice to simply not restart something that has already stopped. The station's survival was not accidental. It was structural. And understanding that structure is genuinely encouraging, because it means the political problem is not unsolvable. It means there are known conditions under which a long-duration space program can be insulated from the cycles that destroyed Constellation, that buried the Space Exploration Initiative, that ground Artemis into a succession of sliding deadlines. If those conditions can be replicated for a sustained lunar program, and the structural mismatch can be managed, if not fully resolved, and then you ask what a sustained lunar program would actually require. Not the Apollo model, not a sprint and a return, but genuine sustained presence, humans living and working on the moon across months and years. And the answer to that question is where the vertigo begins. Apollo was not a sustained lunar program. This is worth sitting with, because the word Apollo has come to represent in popular imagination the full possibility of human presence on the moon, as though what those missions accomplished was a beginning that could simply be continued and expanded. But Apollo was not designed as a beginning. The surface stays lasted between 21 and 75 hours. The longest, Apollo 17 in December of 1972, it kept 2 astronauts on the surface for just under 3 days, the same amount of time it took to travel from Earth in the first place. The total duration of each mission, from launch to splashdown, ran between 8 and 12 days. These were not outposts, they were not bases. They were carefully choreographed visits, optimized for scientific return within an almost impossibly compressed window, conducted by astronauts carrying everything they needed from Earth, producing no resources on the lunar surface, leaving nothing behind capable of sustaining further presence. What is being asked of any genuine return, what every current program describes as its actual goal, is something that bears almost no resemblance to this model. Not a visit, not a 75-hour excursion, sustained presence, rotating crews, infrastructure, and the ability to stay. And the mission itself, the actual task of putting humans on the moon and keeping them alive, is far more demanding now than it was in 1969. Not because the moon has changed, but because everything we require of the mission has changed beyond recognition. Consider life support. It is easy to assume, hearing that astronauts have lived continuously aboard the International Space Station for more than 25 years, that keeping humans alive in space is a problem that has been largely solved, that it is infrastructure, settled and repeatable, something engineers can simply specify and scale. And in one sense, that assumption contains a truth. We do know vastly more about sustaining human life beyond Earth than we knew in 1969. But what that knowledge actually consists of, and what it would take to apply it to a sustained lunar presence, is where the assumption begins to quietly come apart. Apollo's life support was not a system designed for endurance. It was a system designed for brevity, and it worked precisely because brevity was guaranteed. The approach is called open loop. which means that what goes in does not come back. Astronauts breathed stored oxygen carried from Earth. Carbon dioxide was absorbed by lithium hydroxide canisters, chemical filters that pulled the gas out of the cabin air and locked it away. Water came primarily from the fuel cells that powered the spacecraft, a byproduct of the chemical reaction generating electricity. Nothing was recovered. Nothing was recycled. The system moved in one direction only: consume and discard. And this was not a limitation the engineers failed to overcome. It was a deliberate and entirely rational engineering choice, because the missions were short enough that the math worked. Carry enough oxygen, enough canisters, enough stored water, and come home before you run out. The lunar module's cabin walls were as thin as 1/3 of a millimeter in places, an almost incomprehensible figure when you consider that those walls were all that separated two human beings from the vacuum of space, and that thinness was itself an expression of the same logic. Carry the minimum, optimize for the window, return before the margins expire. Now extend the mission, not enormously, not to a year-long expedition, not to some science fiction timescale. Simply extend it to 28 days, which is a reasonable and often cited target for the kind of surface stays that would make a sustained lunar program scientifically and operationally meaningful. The open-loop math does not scale linearly. It does not grow in proportion to the added time. The oxygen requirement alone increases by a factor of 19 times the stored oxygen that Apollo carried, which means 19 times the mass, 19 times the volume, 19 times the launch cost simply to keep people breathing. The lithium hydroxide canisters follow the same multiplier. 19 times as many chemical filters, each one spent and inert after use, accumulating as dead weight for the duration of the mission. Sit with that ratio for a moment, because it is not a number that yields easily to intuition. A factor of 19 does not mean a bigger supply closet. It means a categorically different architecture. It means that the open-loop model, which was elegant and sufficient for 3 days on the surface, becomes not merely impractical, but structurally absurd at 28 days. The mass penalties alone would dominate every other engineering constraint. This is why closed-loop life support is not an optional upgrade for a sustained lunar mission. It is a prerequisite, and closed-loop systems do exist. The International Space Station now recovers water at roughly 98% efficiency, including a brine processor that extracts moisture from what would otherwise be terminal waste. That figure represents decades of iterative engineering, of system failures and redesigns and hard-won improvements, and it is genuinely extraordinary, returning all but the smallest fraction of water back into the cycle, reducing the resupply burden to something that can be managed by cargo flights arriving every few months, rather than by an implausible mountain of stored reserves. The problem is not whether this technology works. It demonstrably does. The problem is where it works and why it works there. The International Space Station exists in microgravity. The systems that process water, that manage fluid dynamics, that move liquids through filters and membranes and separators, all of them were designed for an environment where fluids behave in ways that have almost no analog to anything in ordinary experience. Bubbles do not rise. Droplets do not fall. Their liquids form floating spheres and cling to surfaces at angles that Earth-based intuition cannot predict. The engineering that manages these behaviors in microgravity is real and mature, built up over decades aboard the station and the missions that preceded it. The Moon has gravity, 1/6 of Earth's, enough to matter, not enough to make anything straightforward. 1/6 gravity is not a slightly different version of microgravity. It is a third regime, distinct from both, in which fluids behave differently than they do on Earth and differently than they do aboard the station, and in which every system designed for microgravity must be fundamentally rethought. Pumps sized for microgravity, flow dynamics, will behave differently under 1/6 gravity. Separators calibrated for the surface tension behavior of floating fluids will encounter different forces and different boundary conditions. The knowledge is not transferable directly. Each system must be re-engineered from principles that are understood but have not yet been tested at sustained operational scale in lunar gravity. The comparison to Apollo is not a matter of degree, it is a difference in kind. What the listener might have imagined as a return to a familiar destination is actually the first attempt at something Apollo never tried. The moon is the same grey surface, the same ancient craters, the Pabsashudsa silence that greeted Armstrong and Aldrin in July of 1969. But everything we are asking of the mission is not. Apollo asked, "Can we get there and back alive?" And a sustained lunar program asks, "Can we live there, produce resources there, maintain functioning systems there across weeks and months with no ability to simply come home when the margins run thin?" And life support, the most fundamental layer of the engineering stack, the one that must work before anything else can be attempted, is already a deep and unsolved problem of redesign and validation. And life support is only one system. Consider radiation. Apollo handled it, the listener might reasonably think, and the crews came home healthy, so perhaps the hazard is manageable for longer stays. This reasoning feels intuitive. It is also deeply misleading, because what Apollo actually demonstrated about radiation was not that the moon is survivable, but that brevity, timing, and fortune combined to protect 12 human beings from an environment that was, during their visits, temporarily quiet. In August of 1972, the Sun released one of the most powerful solar proton events recorded in the modern era. The timing was precise in the way that only statistical luck can be precise. It fell between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, after the last crew had returned and before the next had departed. Had it arrived a few months earlier or a few months later, it would have found astronauts on the surface of the moon with no magnetic field to deflect it, no atmosphere to absorb it, and no meaningful shielding in the lunar module to stop it. The estimated dose from that event, for a crew caught on the surface with no shelter beyond the vehicle, would have been several hundred millisieverts delivered within hours. That is not a number that kills quickly. It is a number that would have ended the mission as a medical emergency, requiring immediate abort, and that would have left the crew dealing with the biological consequences of acute radiation exposure for the remainder of their lives. Whether it would have been lethal under the specific conditions of a lunar surface stay is something researchers continue to debate. That the dose would have been serious and unavoidable is not seriously contested. The deeper point is that the Apollo program had no way to predict this. Solar particle events, sudden releases of energetic protons from the Sun's surface, can offer warning times as little as 15 to 30 minutes. If 15 minutes is enough time to be aware that something is happening, it is not enough time to abort a moonwalk, enter the vehicle, seal the hatch, and maneuver to any additional shielding, particularly if the crew is hundreds of meters from the lander collecting samples or operating scientific instruments. Apollo was lucky, and it was lucky in a way that would have been impossible to know at the time, because the Sun does not announce its intentions. A sustained lunar presence cannot rely on luck. A crew living on the surface for weeks or months will live through multiple solar rotations, through periods of elevated solar activity that cannot be fully predicted in advance, and through the statistical near certainty that at some point the Sun will produce an event that demands immediate shelter in a structure robust enough to matter. Yet that shelter does not currently exist on the Moon, but solar events, dangerous as they are, represent only the acute end of the radiation problem. The chronic threat is different in character, and in some ways harder to address, because it cannot be managed by retreating to shelter. Galactic cosmic rays are not bursts from the Sun. They are individual subatomic particles, protons and heavier atomic nuclei, arriving from beyond the solar system, accelerated to energies that have no analogue in ordinary experience. A single galactic cosmic ray particle can carry the kinetic energy of a professionally pitched baseball concentrated into a single atomic nucleus. Sit with that for a moment. A baseball thrown by a professional pitcher is moving at roughly 90 miles per hour, and the energy of that object, the full weight of it, yes, the full speed of it, compressed into something smaller than you can see, smaller than you can conceive of seeing, moving at a fraction of the speed of light and passing through matter with a directness that ordinary shielding barely affects. These particles do not stop at the wall. They pass through it. They pass through you. And as they pass, they deposit energy along their path, damaging cells and DNA in ways that accumulate silently over time, raising the risk of cancer with every additional day of exposure. The Moon's surface offers no magnetic field protection. Earth's magnetosphere deflects or redirects a large fraction of cosmic radiation before it reaches the atmosphere. The Moon has neither. A crew on the lunar surface is exposed to the full galactic environment, immoderated only by what they carry with them and what they build around themselves. Then there is temperature. The equatorial lunar surface reaches roughly 120 degrees Celsius in direct sunlight and drops to roughly negative 170 degrees Celsius in shadow. If you are sitting in a room right now, the air around you is probably somewhere between 18 and 23 degrees Celsius. The swing between sunlit and shadowed lunar surface is nearly 300 degrees Celsius in either direction from that comfort zone. 300 degrees. The wall between those two conditions on the lunar surface can be a matter of meters. The terminator line, the boundary between lunar day and lunar night, moves slowly, but within a surface structure. Yes, the thermal stress of cycling between those extremes would be experienced by every material in the system. Metals expand and contract. Seals fatigue. Joints loosen. Materials that perform perfectly under laboratory conditions fail over cycles of thermal stress that accumulate across weeks and months. A 3-day Apollo visit barely began this process. A sustained habitat will need to survive hundreds of thermal cycles across its operational lifetime, and every cycle is an opportunity for failure in a system where failure has no repair crew arriving from outside. The lunar night makes this worse in a way that the simple temperature figure does not fully capture. The lunar day-night cycle lasts 29.5 Earth days, roughly 14 days of sunlight, followed by roughly 14 days of darkness. A habitat on the equator would need to survive nearly 2 weeks without any solar power, which is the reason mission planners have focused so heavily on the South Pole, where the Moon's axial tilt of 1.5 degrees from the ecliptic creates illumination conditions that the equatorial regions cannot offer. At the best locations near the lunar South Pole, certain elevated peaks receive approximately 90% illumination even as the broader region cycles through its seasons. These peaks of near-eternal light are real and have been identified from orbital imaging, and they represent one of the few genuine advantages a lunar outpost would have over equatorial landing sites. But even 90% illumination means 10% darkness, and 10% of a 29.5-day cycle is nearly 3 days of night at minimum, which demands either stored energy reserves or a supplemental power source capable of bridging the gap. The Fission Surface Power Project being developed by NASA targets approximately 40 kilowatts per unit, enough to sustain a small habitat's essential systems through the lunar night, and a meaningful step toward energy independence from the sun. It is not a trivial engineering achievement. It represents a serious commitment to solving the power problem in a way that solar panels alone cannot. And yet, 40 kilowatts is roughly what a small cluster of American homes consumes, and it is the floor of what a functioning outpost would require, not the ceiling. And then there is dust. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who flew on Apollo 17 in December of 1972, reported hay fever-like symptoms from lunar dust that had entered the cabin on the crew's equipment and suits after their surface excursions. He was not allergic to the Moon in any clinical sense. What he encountered was the physical character of lunar regolith, particles that are not rounded and worn smooth by water or wind, the way terrestrial dust particles are, because the Moon has never had either. Lunar regolith particles are jagged glass and mineral shards, fractured by billions of years of micrometeorite impacts, and they carry a persistent electrostatic charge from constant exposure to solar, ultraviolet radiation and the solar wind. They cling to everything. They are nearly impossible to brush off a suit because their charge makes them adhesive, and their jagged geometry means they do not slide past surfaces. They hook into them. They worked their way into suit joints and equipment seals on every Apollo mission, abrading materials and causing wear that engineers had not fully anticipated. On a 3-day mission, that abrasion is a manageable nuisance. On a 30-day mission, those same suit joints would need to survive 10 times the cycles, and the dust does not stop accumulating. It coats solar panels and reduces their efficiency. It works into mechanical systems and accelerates wear. It enters habitat airlocks and rides in on suits and equipment, and eventually infiltrates any volume where humans move back and forth between the surface and the pressurized interior. And the hazard is not only mechanical. Lunar dust particles are small enough to be inhaled, and their jagged edges do not become less sharp inside a lung. The long-term health implications of chronic lunar dust exposure are not yet fully understood, because no human has been exposed to lunar dust chronically. The longest any crew spent on the surface was roughly 3 days, and the dust problem was already presenting itself within those 72 hours in ways that gave engineers pause. A crew living on the Moon for months would face an environment that is, at the microscopic level, actively trying to infiltrate and damage everything it touches. Radiation, thermal extremes, power constraints, dust. These are not engineering challenges that exist in isolation from one another. They overlap. The suit that must protect against radiation must also tolerate the thermal swing and survive the abrasion of the dust. Yet the habitat that must maintain pressure and thermal stability must also manage the dust that enters with every crew member returning from the surface. Every system is trying to solve multiple problems simultaneously, and the solutions must not conflict with one another. Apollo avoided most of this by never staying long enough for the compounding effects to fully develop. This is also why the Artemis architecture looks so different from Apollo's relatively simple 3-vehicle stack. So when people encounter the name Artemis and hear that it involves multiple vehicles, multiple launches, and a small station in lunar orbit, the natural assumption is that NASA has overcomplicated what Apollo did simply and elegantly with 3 astronauts and a relatively compact 3-vehicle stack. That assumption is understandable, and it is also wrong in ways that the previous hour of this conversation has been quietly building toward. The Apollo model was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a backpacking approach. You carry everything you need on your back. You go in, you accomplish what you can within the limits of what you carried, and you come out. That model was not chosen because it was ideal. It was chosen because it was the fastest path to the surface before the end of the decade Kennedy had specified, and speed was the only variable that mattered. The mission design was ruthlessly optimized for the one thing the crisis demanded: winning. Everything else, duration, sustainability, protection from the hazards discussed above, the capacity to actually live and work on the surface rather than visit it briefly, was treated as someone else's problem, and to be addressed in the follow-on programs that the political environment subsequently cancelled before they ever began. What the Artemis architecture represents is not Apollo with better computers. It is an attempt to build the thing that Apollo was always supposed to be the precursor to, a system capable of putting people on the surface for meaningful periods of time, repeatedly, with the infrastructure necessary to keep them alive in an environment that, as has already been established, is actively hostile to human survival in at least 4 distinct and overlapping ways simultaneously. Consider the human landing system. In the Apollo architecture, the vehicle that actually descended to the surface and returned the crew to lunar orbit was the lunar module, roughly 6.5 meters tall with landing gear deployed, and roughly 15 metric tons fully fueled. That is approximately the mass of 2 fully loaded semi-trucks. In a vehicle you could park inside the footprint of a modest 2-bedroom house. It was extraordinarily compact for what it did, and its compactness was a feature rather than a limitation, only because the mission asked so little of it in terms of surface duration and crew capacity. The vehicle that SpaceX is developing for the same role under the Artemis program, the Lunar Starship, is approximately 50 meters tall. That number is worth pausing on. If 50 meters is the height of a 16-story building, it is not slightly larger than the lunar module. It is not twice as large. It is roughly 7.5 times taller than the lunar module, and its dry mass, meaning its mass without any propellant loaded, exceeds 100 metric tons, which is already more than 6 times the fully fueled mass of the entire original lunar module. If you placed the lunar module next to the Lunar Starship, it would look roughly the way a compact sedan looks parked beside a loaded 18-story construction crane. The proportions are genuinely difficult for the eye to process as representing 2 vehicles designed for the same fundamental purpose. And yet, that scale difference is not an accident or an indulgence, and it reflects the requirements that were simply not present in 1969. The need to carry enough volume and mass to support a crew on the surface for extended periods, to bring down substantial surface equipment, and to eventually return with meaningful quantities of material and data from a stay measured in weeks rather than hours. But the Starship's size creates a problem that the Apollo program never faced, because a vehicle that large cannot be fueled before launch and then fly directly to the Moon from Earth's surface. The propellant mass required would exceed any rocket's capacity to lift it. The current plan involves launching the Lunar Starship to low Earth orbit, essentially empty, and then conducting a series of tanker flights, separate Starship vehicles carrying only propellant, to fuel it in orbit before it departs for the Moon. Current estimates suggest that each Lunar Starship mission may require somewhere between 6 and 16 of those tanker flights. The range is wide because the orbital refueling architecture is still being developed, and because the actual propellant consumption depends on variables that have not yet been measured in operational conditions. But even the low end of that estimate, 6 flights to fuel a single lunar mission, describes a logistical undertaking with no precedent in the history of human spaceflight. Orbital refueling of cryogenic propellants, meaning liquids kept at temperatures that make liquid nitrogen seem warm by comparison, has never been demonstrated at scale. Yet the fluids involved behave in unusual ways in the weightless environment of orbit, and the precision required to transfer them without unacceptable losses involves engineering challenges that are real, active, and as yet unsolved at the scale Artemis demands. Every one of those tanker flights must succeed, on schedule, before the mission can proceed. The logistics of coordinating 6 to 16 orbital launches in sequence, each dependent on the last, each subject to weather and mechanical readiness and orbital mechanics, represent a category of operational complexity that the Apollo era never had to contemplate. Blue Origin is also developing an alternative human landing system under Artemis, the Blue Moon Lander, providing what program planners describe as a second independent path to the surface. Yet both approaches reflect the same underlying requirement. The surface stay must be long enough, and the payload capacity must be large enough that no vehicle resembling the original lunar module is capable of meeting the mission specifications. But the lander is only one component of an architecture that includes SLS and Orion for crew transport from Earth to the vicinity of the Moon, the Gateway, a small station in a near rectilinear halo orbit that serves as an intermediate staging point and long-term facility, surface habitats capable of sheltering a crew through the lunar night, power systems, including the fission surface power units already discussed, pressurized rovers for surface mobility across distances that exceed any Apollo traverse, equipment for in situ resource utilization to extract water ice and produce propellants and oxygen from materials already present on the lunar surface, communication relay satellites to maintain contact from the lunar far side, and poles where direct Earth visibility is limited, and robotic precursor missions to survey, prepare, and characterize the environment before any crew arrives. Each of those elements is not padding. Each one addresses a specific and documented requirement that emerges from the combined challenges of radiation, thermal cycling, power generation, dust, and extended duration that were catalogued earlier. Taken together, they describe not a mission, but an expedition, the kind that requires months of preparation, staged delivery of equipment, and infrastructure that is already in place when the crew arrives. Apollo was a backpacking trip into a desert. Artemis, in its full architecture, is closer to establishing a research station in Antarctica, where the environment will kill you without preparation, and the preparation takes years. Everything explored so far converges on a single uncomfortable truth that most space enthusiasts would rather not confront. And that uncomfortable truth is this: the problem has never been whether we could go back. The problem has always been whether we would choose to keep choosing to go back. Year after year, administration after administration, through budget negotiations and shifting priorities and the slow erosion of urgency that follows any crisis once the crisis passes. The engineering challenges documented in everything that came before this moment are real and formidable and worthy of the careful attention they received. But engineering problems, at their core, have solutions. You can model a combustion chamber. You can run a dust abrasion test. You can iterate a life support algorithm until it reaches the efficiency you need. Political will is not an engineering problem. It does not respond to iteration. And every program that has tried to carry humanity back to the lunar surface since 1972 has ultimately collapsed not under the weight of its technical ambitions, but under the pressure of exactly this question: who will still be in the room, still funding this, still committed to this, a decade from now? But something has changed, and it would be a failure of honesty to describe the current moment as simply another iteration of the same cycle that swallowed the Space Exploration Initiative and Constellation before it. Something structurally different is present now that was not present in 1989 and was not present in 2004. And understanding what that difference is requires looking at two forces that operate largely outside the machinery of government appropriations. The first is commercial. SpaceX is not a NASA contractor in the traditional sense, meaning it is not a company whose survival depends on the continuation of any particular government program. The company's development of the Starship vehicle, the vehicle at the center of the Artemis human landing system, is driven by objectives that extend far beyond the lunar program and far beyond the political cycle of any single administration. Elon Musk has stated publicly and repeatedly that the company's central long-term goal is the establishment of a self-sustaining presence on Mars, and Starship is the vehicle designed to execute that mission. The lunar work is not the destination for SpaceX. It is a waypoint on a path the company intends to follow, regardless of what any particular Congress decides. This creates a structural condition with no real precedent in the history of human deep space exploration. A private organization with independent financial motivation is developing the most critical piece of hardware in the architecture, not because a government contract requires it, but because the company needs the vehicle anyway for its own reasons. If NASA cancelled its portion of the Starship contract tomorrow, SpaceX would continue developing Starship. The orbital refueling problem would continue being worked. The vehicle would continue flying test missions. The knowledge would continue accumulating. That is a fundamentally different situation than the one that killed Constellation, where cancelling the program meant every contractor stopped work immediately because there was no other customer. The second force is geopolitical, and it operates with a different kind of pressure, not the pressure of commercial incentive, but the pressure of perceived strategic consequence. China landed the Chang'e 4 mission on the lunar far side in 2019, a genuine technical achievement that no other nation had accomplished. In 2020, the Chang'e 5 mission returned lunar samples to Earth for the first time since the Soviet lunar program of the 1970s. Nearly half a century of gap closed in a single mission. China's stated target for a crewed lunar landing is approximately 2030, and China and Russia have announced plans for an international lunar research station of their own, targeted for the late 2020s and early 2030s. Neither China nor Russia has signed the Artemis Accords, and the diplomatic framework now endorsed by more than 40 nations that governs norms of behavior for lunar exploration. Two parallel lunar programs are being developed simultaneously, operating under different legal and diplomatic frameworks, with incompatible approaches to questions of resource extraction, base siting, and long-term presence. The competitive pressure this creates is real in a way that budget discussions rarely are, because it connects the lunar program to questions of national standing that resonate far beyond the community of space policy professionals. Congress tends to fund things that feel like contests. Apollo was funded as a contest. The current moment carries at least a structural echo of that dynamic, and it is worth pausing here to acknowledge something rarely said in discussions of space policy. A democracy sustained a single program for a quarter century. That fact deserves more weight than it typically receives. The International Space Station has had a continuous human presence since November of 2000, across 5 presidential administrations, through the Columbia disaster, through the retirement of the shuttle that built it, through years when American astronauts could only reach it by purchasing seats on Russian Soyuz vehicles, and through a period of significant geopolitical tension with Russia that made that dependency deeply uncomfortable. It survived all of that. It was not the result of crisis-driven sprint spending, and it was the result of distributed international commitment across enough nations and institutions that cancelling it would have required dismantling not a program, but a coalition. ESA builds the service module for the Orion spacecraft, the module without which Orion cannot maneuver or sustain its crew. Japan is developing a pressurized lunar rover. Canada is contributing robotic systems to the Gateway Station. More than 40 nations have signed the Artemis Accords. This is not padding. Each of those partnerships raises the cost of cancellation by adding another relationship that would have to be severed, another national investment that would be abandoned, another government that would draw the conclusion that American commitments are not durable. And the ISS model demonstrated that this kind of distributed commitment can outlast political transitions that would have ended any purely domestic program. And yet, the caution that belongs here is not small. The risk embedded in the competitive framing, the race language that has begun to attach itself to the Artemis program as China's timeline has become more concrete, is that it reproduces exactly the structural flaw that made Apollo so stunning and so fragile simultaneously. Apollo was built for speed. The architecture choices, the budget levels, the workforce mobilization, the acceptance of risks that in any other context would have demanded more time, all of it was calibrated to arrive first, not to arrive and stay. The moment the race ended, the reason for the cost ended with it. And within 3 years, the last human had left the lunar surface, and within 5 years, the industrial capacity to return was gone. A program driven primarily by the logic of racing China to a crewed landing before 2030 risks building exactly this kind of structure again, optimized for the moment of arrival, under-engineered for the decades of presence that follow. The spectacle of a first boot print is not the same thing as the infrastructure of a permanent scientific outpost. Winning a race and establishing a sustainable presence are not only different goals, they sometimes require different choices, and when the budget is limited, those choices are in direct competition with each other. The engineering is more solvable than it has ever been, and the commercial and geopolitical conditions are more favorable than at any point since 1972. But success in any durable sense requires something that democratic systems find genuinely difficult to produce on demand, something that cannot be procured by contract or manufactured by competitive pressure alone, something that democratic systems find genuinely difficult to produce on demand. That is where the previous thought ended, and it is the right place to stay for a while, because the difficulty is not metaphorical, it is structural. It is baked into the architecture of how democratic governments make decisions, allocate resources, and assign credit. And understanding it fully requires setting aside the comfortable assumption that the remaining obstacles are primarily engineering problems. That if the rockets get built and the spacesuits get tested and the landers get certified, the return to the moon becomes inevitable. That assumption is wrong, in a way that matters enormously. The primary barrier between humanity and a permanent return to the moon is not technical. It is institutional. This is not a dismissal of the engineering challenges. The dust problem is real. The radiation environment is genuinely dangerous. Cryogenic orbital refueling at the scale Starship requires has not been demonstrated. Life support systems capable of sustaining a crew through lunar winters are still in development. These are hard problems, and each of them requires sustained work by large teams of skilled people over years. But none of them requires new physics. None of them demands a discovery that has not yet been made. The principles that would solve every one of those engineering problems are already understood. What remains is the hard, expensive, unglamorous work of turning understood principles into tested hardware. And that work requires money flowing consistently, year after year, across administrations that did not make the original commitment and will not be in office when the benefits arrive. Consider what that actually means in practice. A program that sends humans to the lunar surface and builds the infrastructure for a permanent scientific presence is not a program that delivers its most important results in 4 years. And the first crewed landing is a milestone, not an outcome. The outcome is a functioning outpost where scientists can work across lunar days and nights, where geological surveys can extend across regions rather than landing sites, where the water ice confirmed at the poles can be studied, extracted, and eventually converted into propellant that reduces the cost of every subsequent mission. That outcome is not something that materializes during the presidential term that funds the early hardware. It materializes during the term of whoever comes after the person who comes after that. The politician who makes the hard budget decision that keeps the program funded in year 7 of a 15-year development arc will never stand at a podium and point to what that decision produced. Someone else will stand at that podium. So the political incentive to make the hard decision is close to zero, and the political incentive to redirect the funding towards something that delivers visible results before the next election cycle is substantial and constant. And then there is the legal dimension, which adds a layer of complexity that engineering cannot solve at all. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which the United States and most spacefaring nations ratified during the Apollo era, prohibits any nation from claiming sovereignty over the moon or any other celestial body. This made reasonable sense in 1967, when the primary concern was that the space race might lead to military occupation of the lunar surface and the establishment of strategic positions that would destabilize the balance of power on Earth. But the treaty was written before anyone had confirmed the presence of water ice at the lunar poles, before the concept of in situ resource utilization was more than theoretical, and before private companies had begun developing the hardware to actually reach the surface. The treaty prohibits sovereignty claims. What it does not clearly address is resource extraction. Whether a nation or a company can mine water ice from the lunar South Pole, process it into hydrogen and oxygen, and use or sell the result without claiming the territory as national property. This ambiguity is not a minor footnote. It is a foundational question about whether the economic logic of sustainable lunar presence can function at all. The Artemis Accords, which the United States developed beginning in 2020 and which more than 40 nations have now signed, represent one attempt to fill that gap. The Accords establish norms around transparency, interoperability, the registration of space objects, and the principle that resource extraction can occur without constituting a sovereignty claim. That mining water ice is more like fishing in international waters than like annexing territory. This is a reasonable framework, and the breadth of signatories gives it genuine diplomatic weight, but China and Russia have not signed the Artemis Accords. They are developing their own framework through the International Lunar Research Station project, which targets the same resource-rich polar regions that Artemis is focused on. Two different legal and normative frameworks, neither of which has binding international enforcement mechanisms, are now being built simultaneously around the most valuable real estate on the Moon. What happens when hardware from programs operating under incompatible frameworks arrives at the same crater rim is not a question that has been answered, because it has not yet had to be answered. But it will have to be answered, and the answer will not come from engineers. It will come from diplomats and lawyers and politicians, navigating relationships that have nothing to do with rocket design. This is the dimension of the problem that the engineering framing tends to obscure. When the conversation focuses on whether Starship can complete the required tanker flights, or whether the Gateway Station's orbit is optimal, or whether lunar spacesuits can handle the abrasive properties of regolith, it implies that the obstacles are the kind that yield to sustained technical effort and sufficient funding. Some of them are, but the legal status of polar resources is not that kind of obstacle. The question of which normative framework governs behavior in the vicinity of permanently shadowed craters is not a problem that better materials science resolves. And the incentive structure of democratic governance, the one that makes it structurally difficult to spend money today for benefits that will land during a different leader's administration, is not a problem that a more powerful rocket engine addresses. These are civilizational scale questions. They are questions about whether the institutions humanity has built to organize collective action are capable of sustaining the kind of commitment that the Moon actually demands. Not the sprint commitment that Apollo demonstrated, which turned out to be as fragile as it was spectacular, but the slow, undramatic, unglamorous commitment of people in rooms making hard budget decisions that will not produce headlines for a decade. Whether that kind of commitment is something democratic systems can reliably generate is genuinely uncertain. The question is no longer about the rockets. It has never really been about the rockets. Where does all of this leave us then? What is the honest assessment of where humanity stands? 50 years removed from the last bootprint in the dust, as with all the engineering and the politics and the competing frameworks laid out in the open, the answer is not the one most people come to this question expecting to hear. It is not about the rockets, though the rockets are part of it. It is not about the budgets, though the budgets are part of it. It is not even, finally, about the legal ambiguities over polar ice, or the competing frameworks of spacefaring nations who cannot agree on which norms should govern the most valuable terrain beyond Earth. All of those things are real. All of them are hard. But underneath all of them, there is a question that has been waiting patiently the entire time. And it is a question about character. Not the character of any single administration or program, but the character of the kind of civilization that democratic governance produces and reflects. Yet 12 people walked on the Moon, not 1,200, not 12,000. 12 human beings, all of them American, all of them male, all of them professional test pilots selected through a process that filtered an entire generation of aviation down to its most exceptional fraction. They went between 1969 and 1972, and then the program ended. And in the 50 years since, not one additional human being has stood on that surface. That number, 12, is small enough to fit in a single room. It is small enough that you could, in theory, have known every one of them personally if your life had intersected with theirs. The entire catalogue of human lunar experience, every footstep and every rock and every photograph taken while standing on another world, It belongs to 12 people across 6 missions spanning 3.5 years. And what ended their era was not a catastrophe. No mission was lost on the surface. No astronaut died on the moon. The program ended because the sprint was over, and the civilization that had produced the sprint discovered, quietly and without much drama, that it did not know how to walk. This is the thing that the history of large democratic undertakings keeps trying to teach, and that each generation has to learn again, because there are precedents for the long, slow kind of commitment, the kind that outlasts any single administration or any single political moment. The transcontinental railway in the United States was not built in a crisis. It was built over years of sustained effort, and through changing governments and economic disruptions and the sheer grinding difficulty of laying track across a continent that had not previously been crossed by anything faster than a horse. The Panama Canal required nearly a decade of construction after a previous French attempt had failed catastrophically, and it required the sustained institutional will of a government that kept funding the project through yellow fever and engineering failures, and the kind of setbacks that, in a shorter horizon political system, would have ended the effort entirely. The interstate highway system, which now seems so permanent that it is difficult to imagine the country without it, was authorized in 1956 and took decades to substantially complete, spanning multiple presidential administrations and requiring a consistent political commitment that had to be renewed, implicitly, in every budget cycle across a generation. These were not accidents. They were demonstrations that democratic institutions, under the right conditions, can sustain effort across timescales that dwarf any individual political tenure. The question is what those right conditions are, and whether the return to the moon can create them, and whether it is already doing so, or whether the current moment is another iteration of the pattern that consumed Constellation and the Space Exploration Initiative before it. The moon does not care whether we return in 2027 or 2035 or 2050. It will be there, patient, silent, indifferent to human timelines and political cycles. And the question is not whether the moon will wait. It will. The question is whether we will stay the course long enough to reach it. And sitting with that question honestly, not the version of it that lives in press releases and congressional testimony, but the real version, the one that takes the full weight of everything that has not happened in 50 years, requires a kind of sober reckoning that is genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer is not obvious, and anyone who tells you it is obvious is not accounting for the full record. The moon is 3 days away. It has always been 3 days away. That fact is almost taunting in its simplicity, because it means the obstacle has never been distance in any meaningful physical sense. The Apollo missions traveled to the moon and back within the span of a single work week and a half. Now, the moon is not at the edge of the solar system, not years away at any speed we can achieve, not hidden behind any barrier that physics has erected against us. 3 days. And yet, the gap between the last human departure from that surface and today spans more than half a century. So the obstacle is not out there. It is not in the vacuum between here and there. Whatever the obstacle is, it lives here, in the institutions and the incentive structures and the attention spans of the civilization that built Saturn V and then disassembled itself. What Apollo proved, and what 50 years have now clarified, is that boldness is not enough. Boldness is real. The courage that it takes to sit atop millions of pounds of cryogenic propellant and ignite it, and the institutional courage to commit a nation to a goal before the technology to reach that goal exists. That is genuine, and it should not be diminished. But boldness is not the whole of what the moon demands. What the moon requires is not courage which flares bright in moments of crisis, but patience which endures across the long, quiet years when no one is watching. That is a harder virtue. It does not photograph well. It does not produce the kind of moment where a nation holds its breath and an announcer's voice breaks, and 1 billion people watch a grainy transmission from another world. It produces budget line items. It produces incremental test results. It produces the unglamorous infrastructure of a civilization that is slowly, deliberately, without spectacle, building something designed to outlast the people who started it. Yet the moon is close. It has always been close. We are the ones who have to decide to stay the course long enough to reach it. Whether we will, whether the institutions that govern human collective action are capable of generating that kind of sustained patience across the timescales the project actually demands, is a question that remains genuinely open. That question has no answer yet. Not because we lack the data, but because the answer is still being written. In every budget negotiation and every political transition and every slow, unglamorous year of work that no one outside the field will ever hear about. The question is open, and it is ours to answer. 12 people walked on the moon. That number is so small and so precise and so final that it carries a particular weight every time you return to it. Not 1,200 and not 12,000. 12. The same number as the months in a year. The same number as eggs in a carton at a grocery store. 12 human beings out of the 8 billion now alive and the many billions who lived and died before them have stood on another world and looked back at this one. And the last of them left in December of 1972, more than 50 years ago, and no one has been back. 12 names, one footprint record that has sat untouched and undisturbed in the lunar dust for longer than most of the people alive today have been alive. There is something about that stillness that rewards dwelling on. The moon does not know anyone has been there. The dust that Harrison Schmitt disturbed on the final Apollo excursion has settled back into the same patient, the ancient quiet that characterized it before any human being ever left the ground. The sun rises over those old landing sites once every 29.5 Earth days, sweeps across the scattered equipment and the flags and the faint impressions in the regolith, and sets again, and the cycle repeats, indifferent to what those objects mean, or who left them, or whether anyone is coming back. The moon does not wait for us. It does not urge us forward. It simply continues, 3 days away, as it has continued for 4 billion years and will continue long after whatever civilizations succeed us have risen and fallen in their turn. And what this entire story, laid out from the first extraordinary sprint to the long institutional stumble that followed, ultimately reveals is something that is less about rockets than it is about the shape of human attention. What we are capable of under pressure is not what we are capable of across decades of quiet. The machinery of democratic civilization, the budget cycles, the political transitions, the competing priorities, the attention that flows toward crisis and retreats when the crisis resolves. That machinery was never designed for the timescales that hard permanent things require. Apollo was not a demonstration that we could do this. Apollo was a demonstration that we could do this once, under conditions that will never be recreated, sustained by a fear that has since dissolved. What the 50 years since have revealed is the much harder truth underneath, that doing it durably, and doing it as a permanent extension of where human beings live and work, requires a kind of institutional patience that does not come naturally to any of the structures we have built to govern ourselves. But here is what sits quietly at the center of all of it, and what may be the most important thing to carry away. The moon is 3 days away. That is not a poetic shorthand or an approximation designed to make a point. It is a literal description of the travel time achieved by hardware built more than half a century ago, using tools and tolerances and computational power that would seem primitive now. 3 days. The obstacle has never been the distance. It has never been the vacuum or the radiation or the temperature swings or even the engineering, as ferocious as those challenges genuinely are. Yes, the obstacle is duration, not of the journey, but of the commitment, not the 3 days out and the 3 days back, but the 20 or 30 or 40 years of sustained, unglamorous, unspectacular work required to make that 3-day journey something more than a flag planted and abandoned. Every person who hears this is part of the civilization that has to answer whether it can sustain that work. Not in a political sense, not in any way that requires action beyond the ordinary texture of a life, but in the simpler, quieter sense that civilizational patience is not an abstract institutional property. It is the aggregate of how seriously ordinary people take the long view, in whatever small ways that seriousness expresses itself. The 50-year gap is not a failure that belongs to someone else, yet it is the shape of what we collectively were willing to sustain, and what comes next, if it comes, will be the shape of what we collectively become willing to sustain going forward. The moon is close. It has always been close. We are the ones who have to decide to stay the course long enough to reach it.